Almost 1/3 of the trips on the MBTA are on buses, but as many riders can tell you, a service that's a lifeline to jobs and schools can also be plagued with delays and inconsistencies. And according to a new report from the LivableStreets Alliance, that's especially a problem for people of color. To talk about the problems and some possible remedies is our guest from the Alliance, the Community Engagement Manager, Kristiana Lachiusa. Thank you very much for being with us, Kristiana.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
I want to talk about one number you referred to in this report, and that's from an earlier report, and this is 64 hours. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so the 64 hours number is being pulled from a report that was released by MAPC. And what this means is Black riders have been found to spend 64 more hours on buses per year compared to their white counterparts. And this is not something that is new to our system, but a disparity that's really been ongoing for a number of years now. And the reason that we wrote this report is the MBTA is about to go through a bus network redesign. So we have an opportunity to look at this disparity and make some changes.
Now, I think what I'm reading in this disparity is that you're talking about a population that's more likely to rely on public transportation simply because they don't have cars, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say, it sort of depends. There are a number of people, regardless of their racial demographics, that do have cars. However, I think one of the reasons that we're focusing on this in this report is not just people of color, but also low-income folks. And how do we provide people, regardless of where they live in the city, good, reliable choices for how they get around? And in certain areas of the city, we have the red line and the orange line and the green line, which have their own sets of issues. But with the ever-increasing congestion and traffic on our streets, buses are really feeling the burden of slowing down over the time and really just not being as effective as they used to be. And if you don't have choices of how you get around because you don't have access to these rapid transit options and buses is the only way, then it's becoming more and more of a problem.
And what about the problems identified by riders? What are they telling you as far as their frustrations?
Yeah, so the top three things that I hear from riders all the time, and I'm out talking with people at bus stops, at intersections where they're stopping. We lead this team called Street Ambassadors, so people trying to meet people in the community where they're at to hear what are the challenges that they experience. And the real top three things I hear is reliability, frequency, and crowding on buses. So reliability, how can you rely on when your bus is going to come? That's something we dove into on our first report. Better Buses, Getting Boston on Board, where we talked about how can a city like Boston make changes to improve how quickly, how reliable buses are. But those last two, frequency and overcrowding, are really what we talk about in this report. So frequency, how often is a bus coming to your bus stop, and crowding, how crowded is the bus when you get on, are really down to how many buses do we have in our network. And currently, the MBTA is actually 67 buses short of the number of buses they actually need to meet their current service goals. But we know that our current goals really don't go far enough in providing the type of service that's actually attractive and useful for most people as they go to work or go to childcare or health appointments. So we, in this report, did some analysis and figured out that if we want better and more frequent buses, we need to actually purchase between 200 and 300 additional buses. But just one other aspect of that, you buy all these extra buses, but where do you put them? So the other layer that is included in this is bus garages, and we need more spaces to maintain and store our buses. So in this report, we also mentioned some different locations where we really suggest that the MBTA invests in building out these new garage structures.
And of course, you're thinking of the metropolitan area. So which locations?
Yeah, so the places that we specify in our report are those that are already owned by MassDOT, Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So you don't have to buy a new piece of land. And we just, looked at a couple different locations, sort of close enough to the inner core. I would say that even some of the locations that we didn't include, like in Everett or other sort of more inner core communities, would actually even be better, just because you'd have fewer what's called deadhead miles, so less time that the bus is not in service trying to get to their first stop. And if you have less deadhead miles, you can have more buses going where they need to go and bringing people to what they need to do.
With the crowding in buses, I know the worst case, and I'm sure you've seen this on Twitter feeds, but people standing on bus stop on a corner, and there's just no room on the bus.
Yeah.
And then when you get on the bus and it's really crowded, it takes so long to get in and out. I mean, doesn't this just snowball?
Yeah, I think you're totally spot on. So just to add a sort of differentiate the two parts of what you were speaking about. So sort of the waiting at the bus stop and both boarding the bus. So waiting at the bus stop is another opportunity where I think the MBTA can and should be making more investments to how do we have better waiting facilities. A lot of bus stops don't have anything. It's just a sign telling you it's a bus stop. And those that do have something have either shelters or benches, but oftentimes, there's not many heaters in those shelters. There's not many lights. There's oftentimes not maps. And so you're not really setting up a dignified, comfortable place to wait. So, how do we make those spaces work better for those people standing out in the cold in the winter? And then to your second point about crowding on the buses themselves, the number of buses we have and how frequent those buses are really directly relates to the amount of crowding on these buses. If you have buses that are only coming every 30 minutes, you have lots of time for all sorts of people to come and gather and wait at the stop, which means you might be having 20, 30 or more people getting on at one stop, which means by the time you get to the second stop on the route, you might already have an entirely filled bus that might have to bypass other stops, which is something I constantly hear from people of feeling really frustrated that you're waving down a bus and you see the bus driver see you, but they still keep going. Oftentimes, that's not because the bus driver is trying to be a jerk, but that there isn't space inside the bus. It's not safe for more people to board, so they just have to keep going. But if we had buses coming more frequently, more quickly, then this wouldn't be the same. You wouldn't have as many people lining up, and they could be picked up more quickly and have less crowding.
Of course, another problem with bus service that is not completely under control by the MBTA is congestion. So what do you do about that?
Yeah, so this is also something that we really dove into a little more in our first report, but just really briefly, the cities own and operate our city streets and our traffic signals, and the MBTA owns and operates all of our buses. And so in order to have a good working bus system, they really both have to work together. And so what we've been really encouraged to see is that a number of municipalities, Boston included, have really been stepping up and looking at streets and trying to better prioritize transit. We've been working on a lot of projects, especially with the new transit team that the city of Boston has hired, who specifically works on transit and getting more bus priority on our streets, but painting bus-only lanes, making some adjustments to the signal timing so that as buses approach, the green light will stay green for longer so the bus can pass through and not get stuck. It's called transit signal priority, and a couple other methods that help buses zoom past traffic and not get stuck in it. So when I think about city streets, we can't expand them because we also have a housing crisis. So, taking away housing is not an option, but by reprioritizing and more equitably looking at our street space as well, where we have options to help buses move more quickly.
What about the reaction to those dedicated bus lanes? I mean, do they make a difference? At least do the riders think they make a difference?
Yeah, there's been lots of great data about this. So bus riders, and specifically we did some surveying on Washington Street and Rosendale. We found that bus riders, but this has also been done in other pilots that happened, but bus riders perceive a much greater time savings than they actually get. So you do get a time savings. On Washington Street, bus riders would save 5 minutes on each trip, sort of from where the lane starts to where it ends, which, one trip isn't that great, but over the year really adds up pretty significantly. But bus riders felt like 10 plus or even more minutes of time savings. And sometimes just that perception makes you feel better about riding the bus and makes you more motivated to try that instead of driving in your car and adding to the congestion crisis we have.
I'm sure for many bus riders, that trip is a link to, let's say, rapid transit. Does that connection need to be improved in some way?
Yeah, so I think there are definitely, and this is something that the bus network redesign has this great opportunity to do, think about how to potentially link and where should the buses link with rapid transit more efficiently, or where are places that are missing that we aren't serving today. But because of Boston roads, certain roads don't go where we would like them to go. And so I think buses are able to sort of get around areas that, maybe rapid transit isn't serving as well. And they're able to be, you can just change where a bus route is for the day, and you have to communicate with people, but there's a lot of flexibility there, which I think is why it's an exciting mode to think about and work on.
You've also looked at what has been done in some other cities to improve service. Anything interesting that you learned from that?
Yeah, so in this report, we specifically speak about 3 cities, Houston,
Seattle, I think, was
Seattle,
one of them.
thank you. And we found a couple of really great case examples from these, and San Francisco is the third, so and a couple of really great pieces that each of them did, and some also things that are learnings for us to do better in Boston, especially around, so I would say how these different cities have been thinking about equity is a really interesting learning that I think we should be incorporating into our current bus network redesign process. So San Francisco did a great job of looking at these equity neighborhoods and saying, like, this area has a really high percentage of people of color and low-income individuals. So we should be prioritizing these vulnerable populations and helping them get to where they need to go, whether it's a job interview or healthcare appointment. But there's people who don't maybe have the same number of choices, starting with them and making sure their bus system works really, really well. And one of the things that was really great that Seattle did, they similarly had some metrics tied in to say, how well are we serving our, EJ, environmental justice communities. And they didn't just do that on this 1-year basis, but every year they go back and say, hey, how are we doing? Are we still meeting the goals? Are the same people still living here? And how can we do better?
Of course, one of the other things I saw in this report, and I should have known this already, that because of gentrification and changes in the housing market and population growth, the people of color you're trying to do better by, they don't all live where they lived 30 years ago. They're more dispersed now.
Yeah. So I think this is exactly step 1, like why we're doing the bus network redesign. It's been too long since we've looked really at our bus routes and said, hey, are these even going to the right places? Are they going to the job centers? Are they going to where and starting from where people are living? And short answer, no, they're not. We haven't done our bus network redesign in over 30 years. But also, I think you're totally spot on. Displacement is an ongoing issue that's happening in the city of Boston. So, there's lots of really great housing advocate folks who are really working hard to try and help prevent more of this displacement. But we also need to be thinking and going back every year or every couple of years to, again, reevaluate and make sure that our bus network is still serving the folks who need it most.